we will be discussing adaptation via maturity shifts in skull bone growth. Now, to set the stage, let's review an interesting puzzle that we encountered last week, and I promised you we would review in greater detail this week. So back in week 3, we considered what I love to call hot pockets, which are tissue of capillaries, small blood cells concentrated in the skulls of modern day alligators. And this has presented a compelling explanation of the continued existence and commonality in diapsids of the two skulls in the top of the head. When we say, hey, look, a diapsid, here's a tuatara, these are animals that have the holes in the top of the skull. And it is easy for us to say, yeah, they have holes in the top of the skull. But what are those holes for? Recent research by this team showed that this is from, that these holes in modern day animals accommodate capillary packages that have a very specific function for heat release. And these groups, this is Holiday et al. From 2019, I think, they have 2020. This group has shown that these capillary density features are also present in the skulls of birds. But we have a puzzle here. The skulls of birds do not show the big holes on top, as do alligators, as do tuataras, as do Allosaurus. That's a funny little owl. So what we want to review this week is to learn what this has to do with adaptation through different maturity changes in birds. So if we consider a coelophysis, an Archaeopteryx, and a tinamou. A tinamou is a funny little bird that's alive these days. It's a very basal bird. And we have an Archaeopteryx. We would say, okay, well, the Archaeopteryx is more closely related to the tinamou than it is to a coelophysis. In the previous video that I posted sort of for the top of this week, we looked at a few traits we've reviewed last week that link the Archaeopteryx and the tinamou, show that they have traits in common that neither shares with the coelophysis. Fewer than 5 digits on the hand, and they have the half moon wrist bone in the skeleton of the hand. These are traits that we discussed last week that you could place along here. But what I'm placing now are some additional traits that you don't need to memorize as individual steps, but it's more a concept that I want to illustrate for you. We could talk about just this issue of what's going on with modern bird skulls. They don't have these holes. Why not? One of the things that we see happen by the time we get to whatever would have been the last common ancestor of an Archaeopteryx and a modern day bird are that the skull bones are more broad and more thin, as well as once we get to modern birds, they have a domed frontal bone, which sort of covers up the brain case. And they also have a squamosal bone that's slab-like, and it covers up the sides of the brain case. So where those holes would have been between other bones in dinosaurs that are not birds, in birds, large slab-like bones are grown around and cover over those positions. Now, here is an example, all right? These are skulls illustrated from this paper by Buller et al. A few years ago, where we have an illustration of a skull of a coelophysis and an Archaeopteryx and a tinamou, which is today's basal bird. And an interesting feature here, you can see teeth, oops, no teeth. So loss of teeth is one of the things that modern birds have in their skull. But another thing that we can see is that both the Archaeopteryx and the modern bird have much larger eyes relative to everything else than the coelophysis. But also, if you follow these pink and green bones, you can see that they get much larger, and also this purple bone back here, the squamosal, these bones get much larger and thinner and spread out if you consider the Archaeopteryx and the modern bird together in contrast to the coelophysis. Now, I want to reinforce this idea that these are traits these two animals have in common, and we interpret those traits as being shared with their last common ancestor. What we're looking at here is not the side of the skull, but we're looking underneath the skull at these different features. And we can compare and contrast the adult skull with juvenile skulls in these animals. Now, these are illustrations with labeled parts, but I want to simplify it a little bit by looking at, okay, Coelophysis, Archaeopteryx, Tinamou, adult skulls, juvenile skulls. Here's an interesting set of observations. Should we interpret this as, well, the Coelophysis turned into an Archaeopteryx, turned into a Tinamou? No, that is not how we interpret this, all right? We interpret it as Archaeopteryx and Tinamou share a last common ancestor that is different than Coelophysis in ways that we can trace, all right? It's important to understand how mechanisms of those changes can manifest. And here's one mechanism that is one of my favorites because it's so cool. Once you notice it, you can see it in a lot of examples. In animals, producing shapes with our bodies is done by DNA, but DNA isn't one code that tells one story at one time. DNA is an incredible set of blueprints that has a whole lot of options. It's like when you buy a car, you have a lot, if you bought a new car, you have a lot of options for upgrades. And all of those plans are in the DNA, but the car you actually get at the end of the day, you know, I've got a very base model car of the car that I have that's fairly new. So what I am illustrating here is the interpretations that these researchers made that many features that we can see in the skull of an adult Archaeopteryx resemble features that we can see in the skull of a juvenile Coelophysis. The large eyes are a thing that little baby Coelophysis have that they lose as they grow up. Something we haven't discussed in this class is how much animals change as they grow up in shape. But if an animal retains some traits, and all that's necessary to do this is to just mess with their maturation rate. If you say, okay, now you reach sexual maturity and this suite of anatomical features and their expression in your genes is what you will pass on to your offspring. In this case, we can consider that juvenile animals may have been able to create and produce features that adaptation might allow in certain individuals those features to continue to be expressed in adulthood. And allowing those features to be expressed in adulthood can perhaps give a greater chance to the offspring to also have the gene expression to produce those shapes into adulthood. We studied last week a dozen theropods that have important derivations that are much more derived than Coelophysis and have a lot more in common with modern birds. So I'm not saying that a baby Coelophysis turned into an Archaeopteryx, but if we want to look at an Archaeopteryx and say, I can see reasons that big eyes would be nice, but how would you get big eyes? One way that you can get big eyes is by animals that are less derived, simply altering the rate at which they sexually mature and allowing their juvenile traits to be expressed in adults of other species as populations shift. So this interpretation illustrated, I'm adding the arrows to the illustrations by the authors, is basically, look, you know, adult Archaeopteryx has a lot in common with juvenile basal theropods. An adult bird of a pretty basal bird has a lot in common with a juvenile Archaeopteryx. And we can take this forward and think, well, could we look at birds that have a lot in common? Could we look at today's more derived birds? Would they have more in common with a juvenile Tinamou than with an adult basal Tinamou? And sure, absolutely, all right? So a takeaway from this examination of skulls is that yes, we can consider adaptation to be an exaggeration of traits in animals through time and genetic diversification. We can also consider fossil and modern animals to be showing us different intermediate configurations of this anatomy. But remember, I am not saying that an adult Coelophysis turned into a baby Coelophysis, turned into an adult Archaeopteryx turned into a baby Archaeopteryx, turned into an adult Tinamou, turned into a baby Tinamou. I'm saying that these shapes are expressed in different animals, and we can consider the way that our more derived birds might be attaining their features that are exaggerations simply by messing with the timing of sexual maturity in different populations of lineages related to their last common ancestor. Adaptation via different sexual maturity patterns is one of the ways that birds have become very derived dinosaurs.